First thing I'm going to do is take the wheel off, 21mm socket, remove all 5 of your lug nuts. Now with the wheel off, I'm going to remove the top of the sway bar link. For me, I can stick a 5mm Allen in the stud of the sway bar link and a 15mm wrench on the nut. However, this is not the original sway bar link. If you still have that one, you are most likely going to need to grab it with some locking pliers on the back side and then remove the nut. But for me, I can do it this way. I'm just going to remove this nut all the way. That way we can access the 2 bolts that hold this bracket onto the control arm. We'll have to get the sway bar link out first. Okay, take this off all the way. Now let's push the sway bar link through. Perfect. And now, as you can see, that gives us access to these 2 bolts. With a 10mm, I'm going to remove this bracket that holds the ABS wire onto the control arm. It's got a little pin here that goes in the control arm. There we go. Remove that. Remove the cotter pin that locks in this nut. Okay, so I wasn't able to remove the cotter pin, but I cut it flush with the stud. Now with a 19mm socket, I'm going to break this free. And I have to use a wrench for this nut, just because my socket's going to go and jam up against the axle. But it's easier to break it free with something longer and stronger than a wrench. So I ended up having to cut my nut off because it was rounded, stripping off, and extremely tight and seized on there. So now that it's cut, let's give the knuckle a few taps with the hammer, and hopefully the ball joint will pop out of there. There we go. So I have a 17mm socket with a 1/2" ratchet here, and then I have a 3/8" ratchet, which is the only thing I can get in here between the filler neck and this bolt, holding this bolt in place, otherwise it's going to want to spin. And I'm going to break it free from the nut side, remove the nut completely, and then we'll drive the bolt out. That nut came off. Now let's push the bolt back in, and I'll try to get my ratchet off of here. And now for the rear bolt, I have a 17mm socket on the bolt side and a wrench on the nut side. I can't really get anything else in there. Let's break this one free. Let's remove this bolt. Pull the bolt out and the nut. At this point, I'm going to remove this bolt that holds the bracket for the filler neck, 12mm. Now, with a pry bar, I'm going to very, very gently pry down on this filler neck. That's going to allow me to pull that rear bolt out. There it is. Now we can remove the control arm. Now, wiggle the control arm until it comes out of its mounting brackets there. Here's your old upper control arm. Now we have to transfer this bracket for the sway bar link from the old control arm to the new one. So 2 14mm bolts, remove both of those. Now let's put it directly into the new one. Start both of the bolts and snug them up. All right, now let's install our brand new control arm. All right, so let's grab the new arm and slide it into place here. You're gonna have to twist it around the coil spring, and once it's lined up, if you need to, you can use a hammer, preferably a rubber mallet, to tap it into place. Looks like it slides into the back there, but this front area, oh, never mind, it just slid in. Well, like I said, if you need to, you can just tap it with a rubber mallet. Just make sure you don't hit the boot or up here, the top of the ball joint. Either of those two areas will damage the ball joint itself. So let's grab one of the bolts. I remember both of the bolts went in front to back. It's important to keep the same orientation. Okay, I'm gonna try and slide in this forward inner bolt first. That one's through. Let's put the other one in. Okay, let's get in the other bolt as well. This one was the one where we had to move the filler neck out of the way, so might have to do that again. There we go, that one's in as well. I'm going to start on the two nuts. That's one. Let's put the other one on. Now, I want to torque this with the control arm at approximate ride level or ride height. So I'm going to bring it up about here. This is where the old one would sit. And I want to torque the bushings this way, because if you torque them like this and then bring it up to ride height, they're going to be under constant tension and they will wear out prematurely. So I'm going to raise this up with a pry bar and then snug up my two bolts. So I put a socket right here between the ball joint and the knuckle just to space it out. That's about the amount of height that it had before. So let's tighten down the nut. I'm going to start with that front one first. I'm actually going to tighten it from the bolt side, so I'm going to hold the nut with a 17mm wrench. Okay, this one's snug. I'm going to come back and torque it after the other one is snugged up. This other one is really hard to see, but basically just tighten up both. And for this one, I'm going to go on the nut side. All right, so I'm going to hold the bolt with a 17 and tighten up the nut. Okay, that's pretty snug right there. Let's get the torque wrench and torque both of these to 77 foot-pounds. I'm going to start with this rearward inner bolt here. Again, 77. Perfect, and I torqued that one on the nut side, but unfortunately, and that's the better way to go because you don't have to worry about the friction of the bolt. Unfortunately, this front bolt, I'm gonna have to torque on the bolt side just because I can't fit a socket on the nut side, so it'll have to do. I'm gonna get a short socket for that. Okay, that's 77 right there. At this point, I want to raise up this whole suspension arm and knuckle setup because I want it to get closer to the upper control arm. So I have my pull jack under here, and I'm going to raise it up a few inches. That'll just make it easier for me to start the ball joint in. Okay, now you want to take your ball joint, start it through the knuckle, start the nut on. Now you can let go. With a 22mm, I'm going to tighten up this nut. Okay, let's torque this to 92 foot-pounds. All right, that's 92. Now let's make sure that the cotter pin hole lines up. So for me, it doesn't quite line up. I'm going to have to keep tightening the nut in order to make it line up. You never want to loosen these castle nuts to make them line up. You always want to tighten them. So I'm going to go a little more. Slide your cotter pin in once the slots are lined up. And once it's through, go ahead and bend it over to lock it in. You want to make sure that this is out of the way of the axle boot and really anything else that it may come in contact with. So that's locked in. Perfect. Now I can release pressure off of my pull jack. Of course, if you're on the ground on jack and jack stands, you would just be using a regular floor jack. Now let's start in the sway bar link into its bracket. There we go. Let's put the nut on. Let's tighten up this nut. Torque this to 41 foot-pounds. Now let's put the ABS sensor bracket back here. Start in the little 10mm bolt that holds this on. You don't have to make this very tight because it's just going into aluminum, and also it's a very small bolt, so it can either strip or break very easily. Make sure the ABS wire is still secured in all of these brackets. All right. Last thing before the wheel goes on is to reattach this filler neck here. So I'll line it up, put a little bit of anti-seize on the bolt, that way it's less likely to get stuck in the future. I'm just going to pry up on this, line up the bolt hole. All right, make sure that's nice and tight. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, snag them up, and torque them to 83 foot-pounds. 83 foot-pounds. Now take it for a road test down to your local alignment shop.